Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa, ai tiwi. It's fantastic to see you all here for this week's edition of The Hoon on the Kaka. I'm Bernard Hickey, and somewhere else in the world is Peter Bale. Peter, great to see you.
Hi Bernard, how are you? I think I was just going to show the picture of the moon, actually. I could emphasise the moon. I'm not on the moon, I'm in Spain.
Good. You didn't hitchhike on one of those Chinese rockets?
No, fortunately I didn't. And I've been in Lisbon. I think when we talked last week, I was in London. I've been in Lisbon, which was in Portugal, which was fabulous. It's such a beautiful city. And having seen Poor Things recently, of course, I had to go and eat some pastel de nata, although I didn't eat the 60 pastel de nata that apparently Emma Stone had to eat in order to prepare for the act. Because have you seen Poor Things, Bernard?
No, I haven't. I've heard it's pretty spicy.
It is quite spicy. Yes, it's quite spicy. There's a certain amount of rooting, as I think some of us call it. But it's very entertaining, and I would posit to say that it is in fact a feminist film for all of those who. But anyway, the scenes of Lisbon are fabulous. It's definitely
worth 2.5 hours.
Yes, it is. Although, as I've warned various friends of ours, I felt like leaving after the first 10 minutes, and I was very glad that I persisted and stayed for the remaining 2.5 hours.
Oh, good.
And so I'm in Spain. We'll be able to talk about the climate. It's kind of dry here. It's windy at the moment, coming from the Sahara. It's the sort of wind that this place is famous for. It's one of the windiest places in Europe. Yeah.
Oh wow. We will talk about the climate this week. It's pretty. It's not going away, and it's getting hotter, and the storms are getting worse, and the politicians are doing less, and the voters are doing even less. But Peter, speaking of food, can you tell me again what you had in that restaurant in Lisbon?
A pastel de nata. It was it's pastel de nata. They're about the size of, they're about that big, and they are little baked Portuguese tarts which you can get, and that's that's a reference to pastries, not
yes
people.
Yes. So that sounds like woke food to me.
Oh, absolutely. It's some of the wokest food, although it is, they were invented in Lisbon, and in fact, I saw a queue of tourists outside the place that they were invented the other day. It does sound like woke food, yeah. Although it's not sushi or quinoa, but the quinoa thing reminded me of a fantastic Robert Shrimsley line in a column in the Financial Times the other day, where many years ago actually, where he claimed to have heard someone say in Waitrose, the posh supermarket in England, "Do we have quinoa in both houses?"
I love it.
But it doesn't. No story is too small or too irrelevant for ACT to turn it into a cultural war story.
Yeah, I think he jumped the shark this week because quinoa is not being served up to poor kids in low decile schools. They're getting mac and cheese and lasagna. And
good bloody English solid food. Oh, lasagna. Jesus, that sounds a bit foreign to me, Bernard.
And I've got links in my emails to all the things that are actually being eaten. The only sushi that people are getting in these dinners paid for by the taxpayer, about $300 million a year, is chicken sushi, which essentially is a bowl of rice and some very nice looking veggies with little bits of chicken that have been deep fried.
So not sushi at all, really?
No. And I have to say that it's really interesting watching the reactions of politicians in what I call the parliamentary forum, which is this area just outside of the Parliament. They call it the tiles in the
Yeah.
parlance of
Yes.
Parliamentary Press Gallery, black and white, very echoey, and lots of politicians trying to run through packs of journalists. And yesterday, before they call it the bridge run, which is on the way to the through the bridge between Beehive and Parliament, through the bridge one run, we saw David Seymour come out and use this line about, no more of this
No, it's bloody woke food.
woke sushi stuff. It's all going to be sandwiches from now on, and that's going to save us $100 million and take the cost of the meals from, the meals cost $8 per person. That's not too expensive, I would have thought.
Yeah.
And only 4.5% of all that food is wasted, which is actually a relatively low number for any sort of catered food. And anyway, David Seymour's going to cut that to $3 by sending schools pallets of prepackaged sandwiches. And he came out with this line, no more quinoa and sushi, packaged sandwiches for you lot. And then the Prime Minister came through, Christopher Luxon, and was asked about this by the journalists on the bridge run, and was visibly furious at the sort of, oh no, what has he said now?
Yeah.
This is going to, distract everyone from the actual news that I want to talk about. And it is getting ugly for Christopher Luxon. The pressure is really on. Not only do we now have a stalled economy, we have the voters very unhappy with Christopher Luxon personally. They are blaming him for letting the hard right and the libertarian right and the conservative right pulling National even further to the right. And we're now at the point in the electoral cycle, way too early from his point of view, where he is on the back foot day after day after day. And this is the latest one. So, yes.
Well, the thing is, both Peters and David Seymour are so brilliant at social media, and also Peters has never seen a stoush that he didn't want to stop his car and get out and contribute to. So poor old Luxon just gets kind of pulled each way by two people who are both much more charismatic, weirdly, to say that about David Seymour. But on the actual food thing, the kids' food thing, did they change the principle of who gets them, that everybody...
No, so that was the political. You see, the National was hoping that the announcement would be a political good news story, because instead of being cut in half, the number of kids who are getting the meals stays the same. In fact, there's a slight increase, because the meals have also been given to kids between the age of 0 and 5 at non-profit early childhood education centres. So this was supposed to be a good news story for the National Party. Instead, David Seymour turned it into a woke fest. And not only was he, going on about the woke fest stuff and turning it into a cultural war, he was wrong. There is no sushi being handed out in schools. $8 is not too much for a meal. 4.5% is not a high wastage rate, and this is real kick down at the poor stuff that's going
Absolutely.
on at a time when the government, when it does spend money, is spending it on prison beds. $1.6 billion, $2.3 million per bed is being spent. No wonder we're going to have lots of prison beds in 20 years' time, because there's a whole bunch of kids who've grown up on shitty 3-week-old sandwiches.
No, but it's their bloody parents. It's all about individual discipline and their bloody parents. How do you think the media's done on that story, Bernard? Because I noticed that there was a little bit of a tiff between TVNZ or a TVNZ reporter and the Prime Minister in the Beehive press conference, where he lashed out, it seemed, at being asked about this.
Yeah,
he said,
well,
this is the most important. What is woke food, Prime Minister?
Yeah, well, exactly. And this is the problem for Luxon. He has lost control of the narrative. And when you're a politician constantly on the back foot, you're like a boxer, really. You've been rocked, you're on the ropes, and you're not doing rope-a-dope. This is, I'm in a bit of trouble here. I can't seem to move forward. Everyone's coming at me with things, and I just want them to stop. And that's not where you want to be as a Prime Minister. And, for example, this week we had, by lots of accounts, and I'm not talking the usual suspects. I'm talking experienced political journalists who you could argue come from the conservative right, coming out and saying that Monday's press conference, or now renamed the Great Mess Conference, in which Luxon and Mark Mitchell announced the extra beds, turned into a complete farce, a total mess of a press conference. It took half an hour for them to essentially get across the news that they were spending this money to put in place extra beds. Mark Mitchell wasn't across his brief. The Prime Minister wasn't either. And unlike in previous times, when I've seen this at press conferences where, let's say you got a weak minister and the minister's there with the Prime Minister to announce something, and suddenly the weak minister is being picked apart by the politicians in front of him, the Prime Minister steps in and shields the weak minister and knows the background and the detail better than the weak minister. And that was the case both for Jacinda Ardern and John Key, and of course Bill English as well. They knew their stuff, and they probably knew a lot more about the detail than the journalists, which is a sad thing. But you need to know your brief. You need to be arguing stuff in cabinet with the real passion and detail of someone who knows their topic. Mark Mitchell didn't. Neither did Christopher Luxon, who basically let Mitchell be hung out to dry. And the headlines the next day, right across the board, were, what a mess. And I've been surprised this week at the number of people from across the political spectrum now asking serious questions. Is this guy going to make it through to Christmas? And
where is the mess? Where is the mess? What's the origin of the mess, Bernard? Is he not getting enough managerial support from his own team? I mean, apparently he's got 7 people to helping him with media,
social media. Yeah,
what's working, what's not working in the party.
In my view, it's his lack of political antennae, his lack of political experience, and he is just not across his briefs as much as he should be. John Key, who was named Teflon Key because stuff seemed to slip away. No one ever seemed to pin him down, and that's because he was able to dodge and weave and skip around the questions because he knew where the questions were coming from and he knew how to skip around them. That's not the case with Christopher Luxon. His also his personal judgment on which issues to go for, which lines to take has been bad. Right from the start when he was the opposition leader, I watched him be flummoxed on economic issues in press conferences. I know because I did it. And Nicola Willis had to come in and rescue him a couple of times, which is, this guy's a CEO. He's campaigning on being good at business. And this is one of the issues here, because the government has stalled spending, frozen grants, repealed legislation. Nothing's happening. The whole construction sector is in a state of
everybody's waiting
animation.
for something. Yeah.
Consumer and business confidence has collapsed, along with views about right track, wrong track. And suddenly the business community are going, hey, hang on a minute. We were quite excited when they got elected. We thought this would be a government that got the country back on track and that really got the economy going. Instead, the economy has slowed down and there is no immediate hope of interest rate relief, in part because some of the inflation that's keeping those rates up there is generated by the government itself, which keeps pushing costs and charges out to consumers and councils. So this is a really interesting week, I think, in which a week when they should be in control of the agenda with lots of pre-budget announcements and still kicking the opposition for being in charge for 6 years and failing. Instead, on the back foot, defensive, grumpy, and often not in control. And that's the last thing you want to see, is if you're a Conservative government, which is all about being the steady hand on the wheel, keeping things solid and, just letting people get back on with their lives. Instead, we're seeing messy press conferences, extremist politicians dragging the government, which all over the place, the government not controlling the economic agenda, and now having lost the political momentum it should have had just 6 months after being elected. So this is a tough week for the government. I know there's been lots of people who were grumpy about what I'm saying, but I've been watching press conferences for 15 years at the Beehive. My very first press conference, I attended in the Beehive Theatre. It was as a 19-year-old when
Ah, Bernard,
I.
mine too.
Oh yeah, there you go.
A little earlier.
Yeah, and yours was legitimate. I forged my way into the Parliamentary Press Gallery press
Jesus.
conference to see David Longie's resignation press conference. You were probably there, were you?
No, 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 no. He was still Prime Minister when I left.
Ah,
Yeah,
well,
no,
I got into that one.
I think I've said this before here, but I used to be, I've decided that the press gallery was all a bunch of softies. And so I went in as Mr. Hard, but I was only about 14, so I looked totally ridiculous. Yes.
Yeah, there's a
Carry
few
on.
people in the press gallery like that right now who've gone in hard and fallen on. I'm not suggesting you fell on your face. There's been a few people who've done that. But anyway, I've been watching these things for 40 years, almost 40 years. And some of the performances from Christopher Luxon so far have been the worst I've seen. And I have seen some very good ones, and good ones from his side of politics. So Bill English, John Key are substantial, adept, clever, and on the whole, effective politicians, as
Oh,
was
but Bernard,
Jacinda
it's just the
Ardern.
way I roll.
Yeah. That's going to be the quote of the year.
He definitely hasn't got his aces in the right places then, has he?
No. And this is the problem for the National Party. They have the wrong ace in the wrong place. And when he says, this is how I roll, the worry is this is
They're
how
going to
he
roll
will
him.
have
Exactly.
rolled.
Yeah, exactly. I was really struck, Bernard, listening to you will be aware, that everybody will be aware, that with the British local elections last week and a couple of by-elections, that Rishi Sunak got into rather a lot of poo at the end of that. And of course, yesterday we had the defection of a truly ghastly Conservative MP from Dover, Mrs. Elphick, across to Labour, which is not entirely good for either of them in a way. But the message from most Tories, particularly sort of hyper conservative ones like Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, was okay. It's too late. It's too late to roll him. He owns what happens now. Everything is down to him. But I was really struck with the similarity in the language, but that Rishi Sunak uses. I mean, we're going to deliver. This is about delivery for the British people. This is delivering. Everything is about, delivering and objectives. It's another kind of managerial approach to politics, and it isn't working. I think the other thing, Bernard, that it seems to me from New Zealand, and you've kind of touched on this, is the talking ourselves into negativity,
Yeah.
talking
I mean,
into a recession, really.
Exactly. I mean, it's like macroeconomics 101. Watch out where the animal spirits are going. And if you want to make sure that people are spending money, people are investing, keep things stable. Don't be repealing half of the legislation that determines how things are built and not having a replacement. Secondly, make sure you're saying good things about the economy, not things like we inherited a mess, the economy's a mess, we're going to have to tighten our belts. And everyone says, oh, gee, the experts say they're going to tighten their belts. I'll tighten my belts
Yeah,
too.
exactly, exactly.
And there's a fundamental misunderstanding here. And I don't think it's genuine, but what has happened is that the political lines, which are tactical and aimed at the voter, at making them understand something, and this is to compare the government to a household, to say,
Yes, it's a
you know,
ridiculous comparison. I mean, it's a real 1970s comparison and deeply unsophisticated.
yeah. And what happens when you do that is that if you say you're in trouble, the households go, yeah, they're in trouble, so I must be in trouble too.
Yeah, exactly.
And so what we're seeing is,
Can't spend above my means, Bernard.
yes. For example, I've been talking to some people in the building and construction sector in recent days, and the sorts of comments I'm getting at the moment are that things are. Unfortunately, I can't quote this person by name, but let's just say
Let's
someone
call him
who's
Nigel.
one of the biggest builders in the country, are saying effectively that the industry has ground to a halt. And that's for a bunch of reasons, using phrases like customers are spooked. And they're selling lots of houses, well, they should be selling lots of houses, lots of demand, there's lots of money, there's no shortage of need for housing. And the rents are rising fast enough to provide an economic justification for it. But all the surveys, businesses, consumers, rental property investors, real estate agents, mortgage brokers are all saying confidence has just collapsed. People don't know what's going on. They haven't got any confidence that the government's going to get back on track with its own spending, and in particular, Kāinga Ora. One of the key elements of uncertainty is that the government announced before Christmas a big review into Kāinga Ora, which is the biggest house builder in the country. And we were all expecting this review to come back from Bill English and his committee. We understand it's already with the government, but it involves obviously some big moves which are not going to make people happy. And that is being held back to be dumped along with the budget. So that's another month of not knowing what's going on with Kāinga Ora.
Yeah, and if you think about the construction centre too, because Kāinga Ora doesn't actually build them themselves, does it? It contracts out the construction.
Exactly.
So that's going to have a very serious impact on the industry if it.
And we know that in the last month there were 59 liquidations in the construction sector, and there is a real pressure at the moment on all sorts of construction companies because orders have ground to a halt. You don't know what Kāinga Ora is doing. More than 450 projects being run by the Education Department were frozen at the beginning of the year. We still don't know what's happening with them. This is the problem. The government has lost momentum. It has lost its mojo, which this was the one thing it said it had. And the guy in charge, Chief Mojo, is scrambling to control his Deputy Prime Minister and his other main coalition partner, and at the same time dealing with a downward spiral in the economy, because every time the economy gets smaller, that's less money into the government's coffers to pay for these tax cuts.
Absolutely.
And so we heard today from Nicola Willis that the big tax cutting budget may not have as many tax cuts as she hoped because there's less money around, and she's still determined to not not borrow too much, because this is now part of the narrative they're having to fight to retain. And this happened because the OECD came out this week and said, hey, you should have an actual tight budget, and that means not borrowing to pay for tax cuts. And the government's sort of in a real corner here, and we'll see how it gets out of it.
Bernard, as one of our listeners' special cases, you're on fire today. You basically started with a soliloquy and gone off on one. Jesus, you should be drinking more Ribena.
Ribena is good, yeah, especially when it's watered down. So. No, it's. I wanted to get that out there because there's been a lot of stuff happen this week. The government's been on the move, and I've been watching the whites of people's eyes, and I can see that there are problems developing, and also part of the reason I'm being quite animated and detailed and going on at length is because unfortunately, Catherine Dyer, our climate correspondent for unforeseen and circumstances, and
she's
not able to make it today to talk about the climate, and we're going to be having Rob Patman in shortly. But I wanted to talk about a report that's come out of the Guardian, which is
it's sort of a measure of the depression of global climate scientists, really, isn't it? It was
yes.
Like, are you okay?
And everyone's looking at them going, run for the hills, dig a hole in the ground and hope that the zombie apocalypse doesn't get you. That's overstating it, but this is really interesting.
Actually.
No.
It was very interesting that they also broke it down, Bernard, by sex or gender or sex, and said that women climate scientists were somewhat more gloomy than male climate scientists, but we're talking about essentially the 650 expert climate scientists who write the IPCC report. So, this is not some sort of wimpy. I thought it was really interesting that they went into their kind of personal sentiment about how they were actually feeling about the very real prospect of going above 1.5 degrees now.
Yeah. I think this is important. This is where journalists can do a useful thing, which is to go beyond the very carefully constructed, workshopped committee language that you get out of things like the IPCC. And we know from years of following it that it is subject to political steering. And asks them, in those moments in the middle of the night when you wake up, how do you think things are actually going, and what do you think is going to actually happen? And you see, for example, Greta Peckel, who is at the University of Tasmania, climate scientist, coming out and saying, quote, "I think we are headed for major societal disruption within the next 5 years. Authorities will be overwhelmed by extreme event after extreme event. Food production will be disrupted. I could not feel greater despair over the future." Now, that's obviously the top quote. That's the one that the journalist has marked in the book to say, make sure that one's at the top. But, when you have the world's climate scientists, the actual climate scientists, with the majority saying that the climate will warm by 2.5 or 3 degrees between now and 2100, for anyone who's had a look at what happens at 2.5 and 3 degrees, you don't want to know. It is ugly. And, this is, for a lot of people, this is in people's lifetimes, my
Certainly bloody hope so. Yeah.
my second daughter was born in 2003, and she will be in her 90s when this is all going down. And for the second half of her life, the only thing that will matter is the climate. And we're seeing it all over the place. You're in southern Spain, Peter. I'm guessing the main thing on people's minds in southern Spain is the drought and the climate, but secondly,
And the price of olive oil.
well,
Jesus.
exactly, yeah. But also, what happens when the 500 million people in North Africa are so desperate from all the disruption in the climate itself, decide to jump on a rubber boat and turn up in southern Spain or France or Italy or Greece or Cyprus or wherever it is. And that for me is the thing that it's sort of a background bubbling away, and lots of people talk about immigration in all sorts of political terms, or talk about it as some sort of ethical or moral issue. It's a climate story, and sadly at 3 degrees, there's however many people in Europe.
You're right, but it is a live strategic question and problem. I mean, on this coast, I could look out my window now and see Tangier across there, and almost every day, there are boats that come across. Shoddy little fishing boats. These are not the turbocharged boats that people bring the drugs across to Barbate and then run up on the beach and run away with all the drugs.
You sound very informed, Peter.
Yeah, right. Well, it's worth looking on YouTube at some of the boats that they use to smuggle drugs across from North Africa to Barbate, and the speed and ease with which they get them through. But yeah, it's an incredibly sad sight to see various boats, really pretty shitty little fishing boats and so on, left on the shore here, and they've always got the saddest collection of water bottles and children's shoes in them. Robert, speaking of strategic crises,
great to see you,
and looming strategic crises, just as I logged on this morning from Spain, we've got President Biden finally showing where his red line might lie with Rafah. So we've got what appears to be a clearance operation in Rafah, but it's not a strike. But Biden seems to have found his voice to say, hang on a minute, you're making me look like an idiot, Mr. Netanyahu.
I assume, Peter, you're referring to the pause.
Yes, the alleged pause. Yes, I am.
Yeah. It's still, in one sense, though, a retreat by Biden, because a month ago, the administration they said there was a red line against an offensive in Rafah. And now they've said, oh, well, a targeted operation which protects civilians will suffice. So, in a sense, yes, the Biden administration has tentatively paused an arms shipment to to Israel, and there are signs that the administration is getting ever more frustrated, which has been a pattern since I think November last year, with the Netanyahu government. But it's not really using the leverage that the United States has, and I think Gideon Levy has made this point repeatedly, that the Americans can literally end this very quickly if they want to.
Gideon Levy's not the most popular columnist in Israel, of course,
No.
Robert. I mean, the other aspect of this, given what's going on in the US with the university protests and so on, this could be quite a decisive factor in the American presidency. It's not to be messed with.
Yes, it seems extraordinary the way the Americans have also handled the student demonstrations, which has been some of the media in the United States have repeated some of the talking points is released by the Netanyahu government, that much of the protesters were anti-Semitic, and people on the ground are saying that that's nonsense, and that there's been lots of Jewish protesters involved in the sit-ins as well, alongside other groups, Americans who feel strongly on this issue. It's as far as I know, the protests are still going on in certain campuses. Interestingly, Brown University did do a deal with the students. They agreed to divest any investments which were linked
Actually,
to
Robert,
Israel.
let's just talk about that for a moment, because I think that gets lost in the sort of physicality of the protests and whether they're anti-Semitic and so on. This whole thing is really also related to the investments of I think it's 52 billion from Harvard, and how much of that. So it gets into I hesitate to call it BDSM, but the boycott, disinvest, and isolation of Israel on a financial level underlies so much of this, because these US universities have such big endowments.
Yes, although it's not clear how much of those endowments is actually invested
Yes.
in the Israeli war machine, or the American war machine, which is servicing Israel. It's very difficult to know precisely, but it's clearly been quite organised. The demand has been, the three demands that many of the protesters have made have been echoed on many campuses. And interestingly, a number of students have said that because the American academic year is drawing to a close, and therefore staying on campus would be pretty pointless, really, and camping out on campus, many of them said they're prepared to protest on the streets throughout the summer, which is interesting. So I don't think this issue is going to go away. And there does seem to be a real disconnect between the Biden administration and many of, young people who might be sympathetic otherwise to the Biden administration.
Robert, are you seeing protests emerging in Otago? On
No,
campus, I
but
mean.
we have had staff and students sign a letter talking about asking the university if it has any investments to divest them. There's also been, I think, in Auckland University, some sort of protest on campus there. But we've certainly had almost weekly protests in Dunedin itself, in the Octagon area in the central part of the city. So it's certainly, I think, many young people feel that, first of all, one of the questions, yesterday I was speaking with some medical students. I had the pleasure of teaching them for 2 hours.
Christ,
And
you teach medicine as well. That's incredible.
Well, we do
Which
teach
bit?
a little bit of
Which
social
bit?
science, and that's part of their broad education, and it's an absolute pleasure to teach them, by the way. But one of the questions that I had difficulty grappling with towards the end of the 2-hour session, which a number of students raised, is why is the United States giving unconditional support to the Netanyahu government? And it's a very difficult question to concisely answer. You can fall back on the old chestnuts. Well, the power of the Israeli lobby in the United States, organisations like AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, etc. But this has just been going on for so long. You would have thought that the Biden administration would have had time to reflect. Perhaps it would have helped if other liberal democratic governments, which were allied to the United States, actually had made that suggestion public. But I'm afraid many Western governments, with probably the exception of Spain and Belgium, have been quite reticent to discuss this. And indeed, our own government has been quite tongue-tied on this issue.
It certainly has. The foreign minister, who was also, of course, the deputy prime minister, he's not bad on this issue in the sense that he keeps going back to the need for a two-state solution, which is getting further and further and further away. But it's not really stop now. I mean, I was really struck when you were just thinking about that, the American dilemma, Robert, because it's also very easy to be accused of anti-Semitism and even discussing the level of influence that Israel has in American politics. And I've been sort of rethinking that John Mearsheimer report of maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago, which caused him a great deal of stink. And he is quite a controversial historian, particularly with his views on Ukraine. But he wrote a joint paper, essential book, in fact, essentially arguing that Israel exerted, or the Israel issue and Israel itself exerted far too much influence on US politics and was quite isolated as a result of that. But the extent to which Biden embraced Netanyahu at the very beginning of this, went to Israel as a dramatic gesture of support, but then has been strung along repeatedly and pretty much taken for a ride by Netanyahu is pretty extraordinary.
Well, he's allowed himself to be taken for a ride. I mean, the
Yeah.
Biden administration, the United States is a superpower, but it's been looking like the junior partner in this relationship. And John Mearsheimer has continued to speak out on this issue. He's done a number of interviews I think he spoke to Piers Morgan. He's spoken to a number of people. He's spoken to Al Jazeera, and he's very forthright in his views. It was a courageous book by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. I think it was about 15 years ago, The Israeli Lobby. And he remains pessimistic mainly because, as he sees it, the extraordinary penetration of American politics in terms of financial support and penetration in the American political system. So many senators and members of the House of Representatives.
I was also struck, Robert, by a remark that Netanyahu made this week, where he said that if we don't protect ourselves, no one will. We cannot trust the promises of Gentiles. Which is an extraordinarily sort of religious way to describe the situation.
But I think he may have been placating his far-right coalition there. Remember, he's under enormous pressure from some pretty extreme figures who always said that the Rafah offensive, the final offensive as they called it, must go ahead. And they don't seem to be particularly. They say that they're hoping that the civilians will move again, but of course these same Palestinians, 1.4 or 1.5 million of them, they were given assurances early on that Rafah was a safe place to go. And so many people now feel they've just got nowhere to go. And I think it's a really desperate situation because it's a very... Before the conflict has started, there was about 250,000 Palestinians in Rafah. There's now 1.5 million. So it's very densely populated. And I think Israel...
Well, but they can go to the new humanitarian camps, apparently.
Well, they can go to the beach as they're being urged to, but of course that would be, from their point of view, they know that it would probably be a one-way ticket out of Gaza.
That's right. It's a very difficult situation for the Egyptians too,
about.
Robert. The delicacy of the situation with the Egyptians is also really important, really serious. And the whole idea of Egypt having, under Sadat, made peace with Israel and so on. This must be putting tremendous pressure on the Egyptians as well.
It is, but the Egyptians seem to be determined to maintain that agreement with Israel. And we have at the moment a government in Egypt which is not particularly responsive to public opinion, as far as I can see, in Egypt. And it's a regime with a strong military pedigree. It's a beneficiary of something like $1 billion a year in assistance from the United States. So from America's point of view, Egypt and Israel are their key allies. And I don't think the present government in Cairo wants to disturb that relationship. But you're right. In a sense, if this widens, and if there is I think Egypt may be saying quietly to the United States, you've really got to rein in Israel in Rafah, because otherwise our position is going to become untenable. And
That's
that's a
exactly what I was
real
hoping you'd say, yeah.
possibility. We know that both the Americans and Hamas thought they were very close to a ceasefire deal recently, and indeed the American spokesperson this morning repeated, I think it was Matt Miller, that they felt they were still very close to a deal, and Israel has now joined the negotiations in the last 24 hours. But this is a desperate situation where large numbers of Palestinians are dying, both in West Bank and Gaza, on a daily basis. So, and it's, from a practical point of view, it's very difficult to imagine how any effective distribution system of any effective system of distributing humanitarian aid can really kick in until there's a lull in the fighting. So,
Just on that issue, Robert, of a lack of confidence in America's willingness and ability to do the right thing, spreading around the world, and in real question now, given that we're sometimes being forced to pick sides. We've had this interesting speech from Emmanuel Macron a couple of weeks ago, quite strong language, essentially saying that there is a risk the European Union could, quote, die, and that we need, as in the European Union, needs to have a standalone integrated defence against the likes of Russia, and that the European Union shouldn't allow itself to become a vassal of the United States. What did you make of that? Because one of the things he called for was a third way, if you like, people somewhere in between China and Russia and the United States.
I think it's a bit of a revival, the old Gaullist idea that the EU should be a French-led or French-inspired counterweight, democratic counterweight to the United States. And Macron has been enthusiastic about a European army in partnership with Germany for some time. And there are relatively small amounts of French and German military forces which coordinate on that basis. But there's not a European army per se. But I do think, although there is some continuity from the past here, I think Emmanuel Macron is responding to the fact that some Europeans consider Olaf Scholz to be a little bit weak at the moment. And I think Macron is trying to make the running to galvanize Europe for the possibility that Mr. Trump may be coming to power in November, and they've got to take up the responsibility for trying to reverse Putin's invasion of Ukraine in terms of support. And
course,
he's,
Robert,
he has made hints about putting French troops into Ukraine, which of course has incensed Putin and made Putin get his nuclear saber rattling into action again.
Yeah, and of course there's two problems there, Robert. One is that it won't be Macron that does it. He'll be pretty much out once he's ridden in an open-top Citroen through Paris during the Olympics. But Robert, you did a beautiful segue there to Vladimir Putin, who was inaugurated again this week. I think it's in 23,
what a surprise.
24 years. What an incredible surprise. What are you taking from that event, from his speeches that are very much around the protection of the Russian Orthodox state, and that it's embattled by a hostile West? What does that mean for us?
Yeah, well, he's still talking about the special military operation. He can't bring himself to concede they've illegally invaded another country. And I still think it's a house of cards. There's been, if you're following the Russian media and some of their links and social media, there's been some interesting speculation that Putin's is having a massive reshuffle of the defense ministry. Already a deputy defense minister is under arrest for corruption, and Shugoi, apparently the defense minister, is next in line. Now, there are concerns not just about these officials, but also about some top military officials could also be under investigation. And the speculation There's a Russian source who's based in France who predicted Prigozhin's coup 8 months before it happened, said it was in the works. He's also predicting there could be a move against Putin depending on how far this reshuffle goes. So I'm not sure that Putin's position is particularly strong. Russia has paid an enormous price for what was seen as a relatively easy military exercise at the outset, overrunning Kyiv, assassinating Zelensky and taking over the country. And of course, an invasion, this point's often missed, by the way, if he had succeeded, annexation of Ukraine would have given Russia or an expanded, or if you like, greater Russia, having absorbed Ukraine, it would have given it about 25% of some of the food global market. So that would have been quite a significant gain for the Russian state. That hasn't, of course, happened, but I think that we shouldn't. It's very difficult to read the degree of opposition to Putin. The elections delivered the result we all thought they would, but I think there's some real tensions there behind the scenes, and Putin, I think, is insecure. He will reshuffle, and that could result in some sort of domestic backlash. But we'll just have to wait and see.
Robert, thank you so much. I'm so, you're such a polymath. Now that I've realised that you're, doing medicine as well, I'll hold you in even greater esteem than I already did.
No,
But
I think I
I've got a
learned
bit of
more
a
from that
problem with my
session
back.
than the knowledge
Can
I
you give me
imparted,
some
actually.
advice about my back? Yeah. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Lovely to
Cheers.
see you.
Thank you.
We'd now like to welcome into the show a new guest and someone who's had a fantastic week, I think. Jesse Richardson, who is one of the organisers of City for People, a grassroots and really grassroots campaign group that
Kia ora.
has argued for more housing in Wellington, argued for densification, and you could say been one of the most successful, grassroots campaigns that we've seen in recent times. And Jesse, thank you so much for coming onto the Hoon at short notice.
Yeah, happy to be here. Very excited. Like you said, it's been a really good week.
Yeah. So just for those people who are tuning in for the first time and maybe not from Wellington, just a quick update on where we are. The Wellington District Plan has been in the process of being rewritten, and the initial council version had quite a bit of upzoning, as they call it, so more places where you could put apartments and townhouses. Then we had an independent hearings panel process that bizarrely came up with a downzoning of that plan. It went back to the council, who then re-upzoned it, and then it went for the final decision to Chris Bishop, the National Party's housing minister, RMA reform minister, infrastructure minister, a real key player in the cabinet. And yesterday, he not only ticked the box on almost all of the changes to the IHP panel report, which upzoned the city, but went even further in some areas, and there was only one area that he couldn't. Could you give us a sense of how you felt, actually, when you saw the release that came out from Chris Bishop?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I found it a little bit unbelievable how good the news was. I was, hopeful that he would accept most of the recommendations that the city council made. But the fact that he actually, in one case, even went above and beyond the level of housing sort of permissibility that they recommended was really special. And I really want to, congratulate Chris Bishop for doing really brave and important thing. And I really hope that this is a sign that the national government that we have is going to continue to be pro-housing supply, pro-housing affordability. So yeah, I was incredibly happy. I think the whole team at City for People was. I only joined the group last year, but people have been working on this for 3-4 years now. And so it feels really awesome. The culmination of all that effort, all that lobbying, public support, in that we have absolutely won. We've achieved our goals in Wellington. And now I guess the question is what happens in the rest of the country, and can we try and replicate this elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question, because you could argue that City for People, the Wellington District Plan is a type of ground zero for the YIMBY movement in New Zealand. Yes, in my backyard. And some of the NIMBY opposition in Wellington has been amongst some of the most virulent, aggressive, deep-rooted that I've
including
seen.
some quite prominent journalists who've been against it because their houses in Mount Cook end up being overbuilt.
Who's that?
I think isn't it the editor of the Post wrote a piece about how Mount Cook was no longer a green and pleasant land.
Yeah, there was a brief interlude where the editor of the Post was in favour of young people. And unfortunately, that person wasn't able to stay and has been replaced by someone who put on the front page of the Dominion Post today an article about the dangers of densification and losing your sunlight. It was like some sort of trip back to the dark ages of urbanism. But
Jesse,
anyway,
may I just interrupt Bernard a little bit there? You're a young people, and you're on with two. You're on with. I can see that. This is the magic of video, and you're on with two old men who both own houses and they're quite comfortable to be. Well, Bernard would like 5 stories built next to him on Waiheke, which isn't going to happen. What took you into this area, Jesse? Why are you bothering with this rather than just concentrating on girls and cars? I'm kidding. That's very patronising of me to say, but
I'm not
it's a joke. What took you into this area?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not a car guy. I'm a biker, so that takes that out of the running already.
but there's some very sexy electric bikes, Jesse. You need to
There
get
are,
into that.
I electric bike around Wellington actually. Big bike lane fan. But yeah, I don't know. I guess like you pay so much of your money in rent when you're a student, and it feels like any student you talk to, any young person you talk to, no matter whether or not they're politically involved, whether they vote, whether they don't vote, everyone hates rent. Everyone hates their landlord. Everyone's like, this is really upsetting. And I was originally interested in national politics, getting involved in that kind of thing. But I think over the last few years, I and a lot of other people have realized that local politics is just really fertile ground. Like there's so much low-hanging fruit. There's so many really clearly beneficial changes that can be made. And because it's all local and because it's all smaller scale, you can really have an impact. Like there are individual conversations that have happened between some person who really cares or knows a lot and an individual decision maker where that one-on-one conversation changed the course of housing somewhere. So I don't know, I guess like I'm just a naturally politically interested person. I think you kind of have to be to get into this, but to just realize over time that change happens in local government on a much smaller scale. And so you can actually have a much bigger impact, I think is a big thing that has been drawing a lot of people. And hopefully a lot more people will be inspired to see that, a plucky group of 20 somethings without really any money or institutional backing were able to make this change that, who knows what else can be achieved.
So what would you recommend?
It's a really positive thing to hear, Jesse, without being patronising, so I was kind of saying a joke before, but
No, it's fine.
What's the ideal state? I mean, you mentioned cycling and so on, because it's about livable cities and about cities that, I read from various people on social media in New Zealand that the idea of a 15-minute city is a World Economic Forum globalist conspiracy. You're trying to bring it back to things that actually affect people's real lives.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think me or most of the people, City for People, think about things in terms of ideas like a 15-minute city. I mean, that sounds kind of nice. I feel like that's kind of been blown a bit out of proportion, like you said. The way I think about it is like my rent for a given level of building used to be this much, and I'm hoping that in 5 years it's this much. And that's basically like my main driving goal and what I think about. And that's to me is like what we should be focusing on most of all, because that is what, the average person really cares about is just how much is your rent? What are you paying? What are you getting for it in terms of the quality of your housing? But there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes with that. And I'm really excited that if we get a lot more denser housing, all of that awesome stuff like having really walkable and accessible neighborhoods and better public transport and stuff will all come along with it. But yeah, just like focusing on the basic material stuff is what I'm really like keen on, I guess.
And Jesse, what sort of advice then would you give to nascent YIMBY campaign groups in Christchurch, for example, where they've got a big task on their hands? even Auckland, I was at ground zero for the Auckland Unitary Plan, and that was quite a galvanizing moment for me, actually, to be in the room for 10 hours when, in 2016, when a group of young people from South Auckland and West Auckland begged some old white people to allow them to live in their own city. And the old white people at the back of the room, some of whom had dyed their hair blue, yelled and screamed at those young people, "Get out of our city. You're the wrong colour."
What?
Yeah. We don't want you in our city. You're going to ruin our leafy paradise. And actually, they won because Remuera Parnell, Mount Eden,
Don't say
Ponsonby,
it. Don't say
Greyland,
it. Don't say it.
Hoon Bay
God.
managed to largely block out the densification. So we have this horrible donut effect now in Auckland, where there's an awful lot of development going on. Te Atatu, Mount Albert,
Point Chev.
Point Chev, yeah, and also out in the likes of Glendowie and the likes, but not where it should be, which is in the heart of Mount Eden, the heart of Ponsonby, and actually not even in the heart, just along the main routes. You know, Ponsonby Road should not have a single story house on it. It should be all 4, 6 stories, commercial, residential
It will be
places.
Bernard, but it will be, or certainly Jervois
One
Road
day.
will be, but it will be luxury apartments. It will not be places for the likes of you
That's
and me.
that's fine.
Mind
Just
you,
increase
mind
the
you, might
supply.
be for the likes of you.
And you might be surprised. I mean, where somehow some apartments have been built along Ponsonby Road, there are some remotely affordable places along there. But anyway, Jesse, sorry, I've rambled on.
Again.
Tell us, yeah, tell us, tell us. I was the original Yimby, by the way. But anyway,
So I've heard.
yeah. So Jesse, tell us, what advice would you give to Christchurch, Auckland, God knows, Queenstown, and
Oh, yeah.
Dunedin? By the way, Dunedin is, you wouldn't think of it as a place with a housing problem, but they have a real issue with homeless people literally camping in tents on the edge of the Oval, the University Oval in Dunedin, at mid-May. These are people with
Oh, God.
anyway. So, what's the
Yeah.
advice?
Yeah, it's cool to hear about the Auckland upzoning, your perspective. To me, that was like well before my time, so it's this kind of like mythical event that happened and set a lot of other things in motion. I guess I'd say like do your best to be brave and don't be put out of spaces where you feel like you don't belong, like residents association meetings. Like I was pleasantly surprised when I lived in Mount Cook in Wellington. I think the residents association people, I don't think there was a single other person when I would go along to the meetings who was under the age of 40 or 50. And I think they had some quite conservative views on housing as a result. But I made the effort to go along and try and talk to them a bit about it. And I was very pleased that there was, despite what you might see in the media, you might see certain people, NIMBYs, who are very virulent. The average person at this residents association just really cares about their suburb. And if you go along and you sort of don't feel too scared, don't get like shied away from these things, and just talk to people, and so, whether it's your residents association or your local city councillors or other people who are relevant, and just like try and share your perspective, it can move things a lot. And the system is designed so that you feel like you can't say anything and that you shouldn't make your voice heard. But when you do, it's really not anywhere near as scary as it might make it out to be. And I guess it's like a meta level thing is I think it's really important that these YIMBY movements or the pro-housing movement in any city, you need to get good people elected to council to do that. And I think it's really important that when you're thinking about getting good people elected to council, or if you are a person who is running for council, to remember that for the most part, these elections aren't going to be fought about things like housing, zoning. They're going to be fought on things like pipes and rates and really bare bones basic issues, and that it's really important that you get people's trust on the most basic things, rubbish, recycling, water, so that they then trust you to take other issues further. I think one of the reasons the YIMBY movement in Wellington has been very successful is because, well, we have a Labour Green majority on the city council that has voted for all of this stuff. And there's two parts. One is making sure that all of those Labour Green councillors sort of get the housing issue and vote the right way. But it's important to recognize that a lot of the people who voted in these Labour and Green councillors didn't vote explicitly because they wanted more housing affordability. They voted because they trust Labour and Green councillors across a number of issues, things like climate change, things like LGBT issues, which is very popular in Wellington. So it's about when you can build trust across like a broad range of issues, not just housing, you have a lot more opportunity to do really cool things on housing, because realistically, you're never going to have a situation where every person, every voter in your city cares a lot about housing. But if you can tie it into a lot of other stuff that people care about as well, I think you'll be quite successful. And I think that's what we've done well in Wellington.
Jesse, that's immensely encouraging. You sound like the new Chloe Swarbrick. I mean, the old one wasn't bad, but you sound like the new Chloe Swarbrick.
She's still around.
Yeah, and I've joined the Hoon Bay Residents Association for exactly that purpose, as a young boomer
Fantastic.
infiltrator into the other boomers that dominate it and try to prevent things
double
like
agent.
water cares. A double agent, exactly. I look like a boomer, but I actually carry a liberal stick. And so why don't we wind people up by suggesting that we start campaigning for Mount Cook to be renamed Mount Aoraki?
Oh, yeah, that's pretty
The
good.
suburb.
I reckon in
asking for
Wellington,
trouble.
people wouldn't even mind that.
No,
Yeah,
no.
true. Bloody liberals.
Yeah, I
Thank
think
you, Jesse.
I think they'd take that.
Jesse, thank you very much. Lovely to hear your enthusiasm
Cheers.
for local government. And I think actually one of the big risks for the Yimmy movement is that the real stars of the Yimmy movement get seduced by the bright lights of the beehive and they jump into national politics when sometimes you can achieve a lot more in local politics. Jesse, thank you so much. Lovely to have you.
Thanks, Jesse.
Lovely to be here.
And Peter, we're at the end of
Bernard,
the show.
it's a good discovery. He's a good discovery for the show.
Yeah.
seems
No,
like
there's
a
some
very-
amazing people out there doing amazing things and doing a lot of work, and doing it below what we would think of as the national radar. I have this view that local government is actually more important than national government, particularly in an era of climate change, where our real task is to densify our cities and get us out of cars and onto bikes and
Jesus, the
buses
Syrah's
and
really
things.
working with you today, isn't it?
Yeah. No, good fun.
You're a bit of a two-pot screamer there, Bernard. You start with a soliloquy, and you're off. Now let me just finish with two suggestions. One is a skateboarding dog, and the other one is a book recommendation. I just finished day before yesterday the new Salman Rushdie book, Knife, about his stabbing a couple of years ago. And one of the reasons I wanted to read it, because I knew he would deal with the satanic verses, is when the fatwa was introduced, somebody you and I used to work with and was my boss in 1989 said that essentially Salman Rushdie deserved what he was getting because he'd gone there with the Prophet. I couldn't recommend Knife any more than I'm going to at the moment. And if anybody has people in their family or themselves have gone through injuries or even big life illness setbacks, his descriptions of being hospitalized, of the loss of hope, of the sense of that he was about to die, and the things that motivated him to continue living are very powerful. You don't have to be stabbed 17 times by an Islamic nutter in upstate New York, but there's wonderful lessons in it, and also wonderful lessons about love. Very simple descriptions about what it means to be in love and to be loved. So my skateboarding dog story, that recommendation then is Salman Rushdie's book, Knife. My skateboarding dog story is that a council in Yorkshire has decided to remove the apostrophes from places like St Mary's Bay and that kind of thing, which I think probably have already gone from Auckland. But it comes in the same week where the Associated Press said that definitively Mother's Day should be Mother apostrophe S, i.e. your mother. I think it should be for plural mother, and therefore mothers with an S apostrophe. But I think I'm losing out on this one. So it's all about the apostrophe.
This is why there's so many wars in the world, because the important stuff really,
Exactly. And I think we all hate it's being a thing with an apostrophe being for ownership. So as long as we get the important things done, Bernard, it'll be all right.
Fantastic. And I was going to submit for my skateboarding dog the amazing story of RFK Jr. saying that one of the reasons he kept forgetting things and had problems was that they discovered a dead worm in his brain
Yes, yes, unfortunately.
that had somehow got in there. I couldn't find anything to eat.
Yeah,
and
I think
died.
it's tequila. I think it's from drinking the worm at the bottom of the tequila.
Brilliant. Hey, what
It's
a fantastic show.
but which reminds me, Bernard, of course, of the Gippsland gurgling earthworm, which I think is the largest earthworm in the world. And there's a Gippsland gurgling earthworm museum where the slogan is "It's a wormdiful world."
That is one of those statues you have outside at the entry to town. Yeah, I want the worm. Good stuff. Peter, wonderful show. Thank you very much. Have a lovely, safe, warm time in Spain, and I hope you don't stumble across any little boats on the beaches. Ka kite anō, everyone. See you all again next
Thank you,
week
everybody.
at 5 o'clock. It's been the Hoon.